Eugenics is one of those ideas that we, as a society, have decided is immoral and evil. We look at the photographs from Auschwitz and we read the records from the forced sterilization programs that ran through this country well into the 20th century. And we have decided that those practices should not be tolerated. We know what eugenics is. We know that it's monstrous, and we know the only people still asking questions about it are people we probably should not take very seriously. The problem with deciding that this conversation is over before it actually is that the underlying logic does not disappear just because we have stopped looking at it that way. And the argument that I want to make today is that one of the most common and emotionally persuasive and socially accepted rationales in contemporary life operates on a eugenic logic that we have collectively agreed not to examine. Now, I want to be precise about what I am and am not arguing. I'm not arguing that everyone who has ever supported abortion access is eugenicists in the historical sense. I'm not drawing a straight line between a private medical decision and the gas chambers, because that straight line is not straight. What I am arguing is that a specific subset of abortion reasoning that terminates a pregnancy because of disability, genetic condition, economic burden, or even perceived inconvenience, shares its underlying logic with eugenics thinking in a way that is philosophically meaningful and practically consequential. And that the reason we don't talk about this is not because the argument has been refuted correctly, but because it's really uncomfortable. And discomfort has a way of being mistaken for being wrong. And the reason I bring this up is because just a few weeks ago, YouTuber Jesse Ridgway and his wife decided to abort their child after learning the child had trisomy 21, or Down syndrome. Now, this is the post that they put up explaining their decision, and you can pause here to read it for yourself. For our purposes, I want to focus on three key elements of this post. One, he says, trisomy 21 is caused by an extra chromosome. It is caused by an error in cell division, like a glitch. The odds of a baby having it is 1 in 1,000. Now, notice the language she used here, like error and glitch, meaning there is something inherently wrong with the child, and the baby is essentially defective. Now, the odds of having trisomy 21 are 1 in 1,000, which, when you think about it, is really not all that rare. But what's key here is actual data. In the US, there are roughly 5,000 babies born per year with Down syndrome. The diagnosis number, though, is significantly higher. With routine prenatal testing now a standard practice, a much larger number of pregnancies that receive a trisomy 21 diagnosis, and the termination rate following that diagnosis in the US is estimated to be roughly 67%, meaning for every 3 diagnoses, approximately 2 pregnancies are terminated. So, working backwards, the diagnosis number would actually be closer to about 15,000 births per year in the United States, with about 10,000 of those pregnancies terminated and 5,000 resulting in live births. Now, in some European countries, the termination rate following diagnosis runs as high as 90%. They haven't banned Down syndrome births, but instead have created a diagnostic and cultural environment where termination after diagnosis has become the near universal outcome. Now, the second part of this post that I want to focus on is this. We spoke with doctors, friends, family, and genetic counselors and learned that up to 90% of women terminate their pregnancy after learning that the baby has trisomy 21. And this is very important for our discussion. There are many women who have been advised by their doctors and genetic counselors to terminate their pregnancy based on the results of genetic testing. When you have a culture that encourages women to terminate their pregnancies based on deformities, and doctors who work with genetic counselors, which honestly sounds like it was taken right out of an early eugenics textbook, it's pretty hard to deny that this is a form of eugenics. It's not a form that many people talk about because it's a very emotional and traumatic experience for both the children and the mothers that go through this process. But finally, he says at the end, "And for us, we made a difficult decision that we believe in the long run will be beneficial for our family. Thankfully, we had a choice. It'll take a little time to move on, but we are excited to try again in the future and hopefully have a better outcome." Now, that is a pretty heavy line, especially given the situation. The language used here, though, is particularly interesting. The choice to abort the baby because it's beneficial to his family, and the fact that they will try again and hope for a better outcome is very eugenic-y to me. I mean, choosing to engage in sex for the purposes of making a child means that you should accept the outcome of that decision. Because before genetic testing, there was essentially no way to know whether your child would be born healthy or whether it would survive birth, or what color eyes they would have, or the skin type or hair type, or even the gender of the baby. Now, keep this in mind as we move forward, because now that we understand what we're discussing today, we can move on to the second part of the conversation. In 1989, the philosopher Don Marquis published an essay called "Why Abortion is Immoral," and it still remains one of the most cited and least comfortably answered pieces in bioethics. Marquis addressed abortion from a secular point of view, choosing to forego religious and emotional arguments for the sake of true debate. Now, his central claim is that what makes killing wrong in any case is not that it violates a rule, and not even that it produces grief in other people, but that it deprives the victim of their future, of all the experiences, relationships, and ordinary human goods that would have constituted a life. And he called this a future like ours. And the force of the argument is that it does not rely on any particular metaphysical commitment about personhood. It only requires that you accept that futures matter, which virtually everyone does in any other context. The standard abortion debate tends to get stuck on questions of personhood, when exactly a fetus becomes a moral subject, on what threshold of development confers rights, on how we adjudicate competing claims between the pregnant woman and the developing life. Now, Marquis largely sidesteps that terrain and asks a different question. Regardless of where you come down on personhood, is it not the case that what we are ending when we end a pregnancy is a future? Because whether you believe life begins at conception or birth or some other arbitrary cutoff time frame, the fact stands that a pregnancy, if left alone, will either result in a live birth, a miscarriage, or a stillbirth. By ending a pregnancy, for any reason, but especially genetic conditions, you are taking away a future. And if futures are what ground moral concern in every other case, then the future of a fetus is morally relevant in the same way that any future is morally relevant, which means that ending it requires a justification serious enough to outweigh that loss. So, what happens then when the reason for ending that future is specifically that the future in question would belong to a person with Down syndrome or a chromosomal abnormality, with a condition that might make their life harder or more expensive and more medically complex than average. Because Marquise gives us the foundation that every fetus has a future like ours, and the disability selective abortion introduces a premise that his framework immediately flags as philosophically significant. Not all futures, like ours, are being treated as equally worth preserving. Some futures are being ended, not because the circumstances of the pregnancy are untenable, but because the anticipated characteristics of the person who would inhabit that future are considered reason enough to prevent the future from existing. And that is selection. And it is worth asking, with genuine seriousness, and without assuming the answer, whether a ranking of futures by their anticipated characteristics is something other than what it sounds like. It is also worth considering that genetic testing is just that, a test. There is no genetic test that claims to be 100% accurate, except maybe gender, but even that can be wrong. So if we advise women to terminate pregnancies based on the possibility of a genetic condition, then that can certainly be considered a form of eugenics, because we are not terminating the condition itself, only the possibility of it. I mean, when I did my own genetic testing, the results did not say that my baby is 100% healthy. The results say my baby's chance of having any of these genetic conditions is lower than that of the average population. So theoretically, my child could still have a genetic condition that we simply don't know about yet, because no genetic test is going to guarantee an outcome one way or the other. So what we're actually doing when we advise women to terminate their pregnancies based on genetic testing is advising them to terminate that gene mutation. Trisomy 21 is simply a genetic marker for Down syndrome. So the less babies that we carry to term, the less likely that gene mutation will carry on through the next generation. So when Jesse says we hope for a better result next time, he is essentially supporting the practice of genetic selection, which is exactly what eugenics is. If the next child tests negative for these genetic deformities, his wife has successfully eliminated a gene mutation that can be passed down. And if you do this for generations, you end up eliminating an entire group of people, which is what Europe hopes to do. But more on that in just a moment. Now, Rosalind Hurst-House's contribution to this conversation comes from a direction that is different from Marquise. Virtue ethics in Hurst-House's formulation is not primarily about the permissibility of actions. It is about what actions reveal about the character and orientation of the person performing them, and, by extension, what the aggregate of those actions reveals about the culture that has normalized them. The question she would want us to ask is not whether any individual parent made the wrong or right choice, but what the pattern of those choices, when institutionally supported and culturally accepted, says about what kind of variation a society has decided it can tolerate. In Jesse's own words, a child identified as having trisomy 21 is a glitch, and up to 90% of pregnancies are terminated. Or, in other words, for no other reason, it is acceptable to abort a baby at any gestational age if they are defective, and it is supported by both society and governmental bodies. Take Iceland, for example. Iceland has, by most measures, effectively eliminated Down syndrome births through routine prenatal testing and the terminations that follow. The country discusses this achievement with a tone that is almost compassionate. The framing is that parents are being spared suffering, children are being spared difficult lives, and the practice reflects a commitment to well being rather than a judgment about disability.
The misinformation was the first part that our organization highlighted. It was like, okay, whatever the story is, the thing that we're going to respond to is like the fear-based language.
Executive Director Kira Knudsen says fear-based language is something they hear often, especially after a prenatal diagnosis.
None of our individuals with Down syndrome are a glitch. It's not a glitch. They're wonderful, beautiful people.
Recent studies estimate 60 to 90% of pregnancies in the U.S. with the Down syndrome diagnosis end in abortion. That's compared to about 18% of all pregnancies.
The message is that all of us are going to experience challenges, right? And that doesn't mean that life isn't worth living and that it's not beautiful.
Disability advocates have responded to this framing with a clarity that is worth quoting in spirit, if not in the letter. When you systematically prevent people with a particular condition from being born, you are making a statement about that condition and the people who have it. And the statement is being made regardless of whether anyone intended to make it in the first place. The culture of Iceland has not declared that people with Down syndrome are unwelcome. It has, though, created the conditions under which they are increasingly absent. And the distinction between those two things is philosophically much thinner than it appears. Hurst's framework asks whether the reasons behind an action express virtues or vices. While a person's intention does matter, intentionality is not the end-all be-all. Does aborting a person with Down syndrome reflect practical wisdom and genuine compassion, or does it reflect something else? Simply an unwillingness to accommodate difficulty, a preference for futures that are easier to manage, and an attitude towards dependence and disability that we would not endorse if we stated it plainly. A culture that treats the termination of pregnancies with particular diagnosis as the obvious, rational, and default response is not simply making individual reproductive choices in aggregate. It is forming habits of judgment, and those habits have philosophical content whether or not anyone is paying attention to what that content is. Now, the most common rebuttal to the eugenics framing is definitional. Historically, eugenics was a state project. It required coercion, infrastructure, central authority, and the denial of individual autonomy. An individual reproductive decision made in consultation with the physician is categorically different from a government breeding program, and conflating the two is a category error. Now, this rebuttal does have genuine force, so I don't want to dismiss it. But I think it proves less than it actually appears to at first, because it assumes that the relevant distinction is between state coercion and private choice, rather than between a practice that shapes which kinds of people are born and one that doesn't. The concept that philosophers and bioethicists have developed for exactly this situation is sometimes called decentralized eugenics or neo-eugenics. And it just means that it's not necessarily a government program, but it is a network of professional recommendation, institutional framing, and social expectation that produces the same population level effect that a formal eugenics program might produce, but without any central authority giving orders. When a physician presents a genetic diagnosis alongside a discussion of termination as the medically responsible and reasonable response, they are not, or at least they are not supposed to be, coercing anyone. But they are participating in a professional and cultural framework that treats certain genetic conditions as presumptive reasons not to continue a pregnancy. and when that framework is consistent enough and widespread enough, and even authoritative enough, the distinction between informing a patient and shaping a population becomes considerably harder to maintain than the formal definition of eugenics would suggest. The American Medical Association's guidance on this, though, is clear. They say that genetic counseling should be non-directive, should present options without imposing the physician's values, and should respect the patient's decision either way. But even with those guidelines, the facts still stand. If you are told, like Jessie was, that up to 90% of people in your situation make the same decision, then you'll most likely make that same decision. Because that's just how humans work at the most foundational way. We see what other people are doing, and most of the time we choose to do the same. So, the question worth asking is whether the broader medical and cultural environment in which that counseling takes place is actually neutral, and whether a patient receiving a Down syndrome diagnosis or any other kind of diagnosis experiences the surrounding framework as genuinely open to either outcome, or whether the weight of that professional framing, cultural expectation, and institutional practice has already shaped what the rational choice looks like before the conversation in the office has even begun. So, if we accept that aborting babies with glitches can be considered a eugenics practice, then this brings up an entirely different way to view abortion itself. Eugenics does not only apply to genetic glitches, but also genetic and economic traits. You see, Planned Parenthood's early history is certainly tied to the broader birth control and eugenics movements of the early 20th century, mainly through Margaret Sanger and the reform networks around her. Now, this does not mean that Planned Parenthood today operates as a eugenics organization, but its origins include real and documented overlap with eugenics thinking. In the era when Planned Parenthood emerged, many birth control advocates, physicians, and reformers used eugenics language about fitness, burdens, and limiting reproduction among the unfit. Sanger worked inside that intellectual environment and sometimes used those ideas to build support for birth control. Now, Sanger founded the first U.S. birth control clinic in 1916 and later became the most famous face of the movement that evolved into Planned Parenthood. Her writings and associations included explicit eugenics language, which is why historians describe her legacy as intertwined with eugenics, even when they disagree about how central that was to her overall mission. Now, this is relevant because we'll dive into the results of her work in just a moment. The organization's early decades were shaped by the assumption that family planning could serve both women's autonomy and broader social goals, including population quality ideas that were very common at the time. That meant that early advocates sometimes overlapped with attitudes that are now recognized as racist, ableist, or coercive, especially towards marginalized communities. And even if Planned Parenthood today claims to not support her ideas, the fact still stands. In the U.S., Black women have had higher abortion rates than white women for decades, and recent data still shows this pattern. For example, 28.6 abortions per 1,000 non-Hispanic Black women ages 15 to 44 in 2021, compared with 6.4 per 1,000 non-Hispanic white women, And CDC-based summaries found that Black women accounted for about 42% of abortions in reporting areas that year. Now, very clearly, this is not to say that Black women are evil or unjust or that Black babies are being systematically bred out. Researchers and journalists usually explain the disparity through structural factors rather than racial preference alone. Higher unintended pregnancy rates, unequal access to contraception and healthcare, economic inequality, and medical distrust all play a role. Now, those sources also note that higher abortion rates among Black women do not by themselves prove intentional population control or eugenics. However, this does force us to face an uncomfortable truth about abortion itself. Even if the abortion is due to economic factors rather than genetic ones, the practice has led to the adoption of the very kind of eugenics that the U.S. and other governmental bodies were engaging in during the 20th century. As a society, we have just accepted economic status as a justifiable reason to abort a child. Advocates for abortion will argue that a mother who genuinely cannot afford to raise a child should abort. Poverty and the documented real consequences of bringing a child into circumstances of severe deprivation are all reasons the child should not be allowed to live. Now, this argument is usually offered as a conversation stopper, as evidence that the people raising philosophical objections are simply out of touch with the lived experience of economic precarity, and that any framework that does not account for material conditions is too abstract to be worth taken seriously. Now, I want to take this argument seriously because it does deserve it, and because the way to take something seriously is not just to accept it uncritically, but to follow the logic. So, let's talk about the natural law tradition, rooted in the philosophical conviction that human life carries an inherent dignity that is not granted by circumstance and cannot be removed by circumstance. This pushes back against the economic argument not by dismissing poverty as a real condition, but by asking what the argument's premises actually imply about the nature of a child being aborted. If poverty is a legitimate reason that a child should not exist, and not that the system has failed to provide adequate support or the community has failed to show up, but that this particular child, in this particular circumstance, should not be born, then we have introduced a condition into human worth that the concept of dignity was specifically designed to resist. We have said that a child's claim on existence is partly a function of their economic prospects, which is to say that children with worse prospects have a weaker claim, and that some children are less welcome in the world on the basis of circumstances that they did not choose and cannot change. Now, the counter-argument is that this confuses judging a situation as untenable with judging a child as less valuable. And I understand the distinction being drawn, because mothers who are living in poverty and choose to abort their babies are not doing it out of hatred for the child or because they believe that being in poverty makes you less valuable. But I do want to sit with what the outcome of the reasoning actually produces, regardless of intention. Because outcomes and intentions are not the same thing. And a philosophy that only examines intentions while ignoring the patterns is not doing its job. If the effect of the economic argument, applied consistently, is that children anticipated to be born into poverty are more likely to be aborted than children who are anticipated to be born into comfort, and as a result, babies with a darker skin tone are kept from life, then the argument is functioning as a mechanism that filters children by economic circumstance. And we can also look at the fact that if you are a wealthier person in the United States, you can afford to do IVF and other programs that will allow you to have more children or even multiples if you wanted them. And so the question of whether that mechanism constitutes a form of selection is not answered by the sincerity of the people operating it. Now, we can debate about how to solve those issues, and we can talk about economic prosperity and equal access to human rights. But here is the very large and hard pill to swallow. If we as a society accept that abortion is morally justifiable because of economic conditions, and as a result, more colored babies are disproportionately aborted, then there are less colored children to stand up and have opportunities to rise above poverty. There are less colored babies that have the opportunity to change their circumstances, and less colored voices to shout out and fight against the disparities. So yes, the choice is framed as a woman's bodily autonomy. But when that choice results in less colored children, less children with genetic conditions, and even more disparities and inequality, then we have to ask ourselves, is that the point? What I have tried to argue today is not that everyone who makes a trait-based reproductive decision is a eugenicist, or that compassion is subject, and not that the people navigating genuinely impossible circumstances are bad people. But what I have tried to argue is that the logic underlying a specific set of very common and very socially accepted justifications, logic that treats disability, economic burden, and unwanted characteristics as reasons that particular futures should not exist, is the same logic that we look at in a historical photograph and call by a name we have agreed to be horrified by. And that the question of whether we are applying that logic differently, or whether we have simply found a more comfortable vocabulary for it, is one that deserves a more honest answer than the one we have been willing to give so far. So, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. And, as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I will see y'all next time.